Well, French President Francois Hollande says no concessions will be made to Turkey on human rights or visas in exchange for guarantees to stem the flow of refugees into Europe. Hollande also called for more clarification and transparency in the European Union discussions with Turkey about a complex deal to ease the refugee crisis. He made the remarks on the sidelines of a gathering of the EU leaders in Paris. Possible ways of tackling the refugee problem, economic reforms, and the rising far-right sentiment were at the heart of the discussions. Next week, EU leaders will attend a meeting in Brussels to finalize a deal to send thousands of refugees back to Turkey. Under the deal, Ankara is supposed to prevent the flow of asylum seekers from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe in exchange for financial assistance of $3.3 billion. The continent is experiencing its worst refugee crisis since World War II. Oh, crossing over to London, joined by publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, tell me, what do you make of this whole Turkey-EU deal and dealing with the refugees?
Well, I have to say, and I'm going to be very candid, the discussions which have been going on amongst EU leaders about how to deal with the refugee crisis are futile. Why do I say they're futile? Because they are not homing in on the reasons as to why Europe is engulfed by a refugee crisis. And the roots of the refugee crisis are Western intervention, Western meddling in Syria. If the West, which of course is ultimately the United States of America, but also the European Union, had the West not have intervened in Syria, had the West not started arming the various terrorist groups in Syria, there would not have been the conflict that there is today in Syria. But because the European Union played a leading role in destabilizing Syria, in weakening the Syrian state, in providing political support, military support, financial support to various Islamist groups in Syria, it's no surprise that there was going to be a dreadful conflict and that thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from Syria would leave. So the discussions today in Paris and previous discussions, they really don't have any significance because they're not tackling the roots. Now, in regard to Turkey, Turkey is an extraordinarily duplicitous, two-faced country, because of course Turkey, along with the West, has played another integral role in the Syrian conflict. Turkey has allowed its country to be a transit for Islamist fighters and jihadists going into Syria. But now the Turks are trying to get financial concessions from the European Union. So Turkey is effectively saying, we can do something about the refugee crisis if you give us X amount of money. Well, what we're dealing with here is two parties which ultimately are bickering amongst themselves over something that they have caused. So we can say that the thieves, that the murderers are starting to fall out between themselves now.
Well, in the interim, like you said, the root of the problem isn't being dealt with, but looking at the refugees themselves now with this situation, do you think that Turkey, you talked about the basic two-faced policies, or duplicitous policies of Turkey. What about in the way that they possibly will deal with the refugees themselves? Because it seems that no one is actually talking about what is best for these people.
Well, of course, you know, there is first and foremost the human dimension to the refugee crisis, and it is a terrible, terrible tragedy what we are seeing. However, how can anyone in Brussels trust Turkey when Turkey is without a doubt allowing hundreds of thousands of refugees to pass through its territory when it could stop them on Turkish territory, but the Turkish government is allowing these refugees to cross Turkish territory and go into the European Union. So I don't believe that any trust. There should be no faith. There should be any trust in Turkey. There should be no faith in what the Turks are saying. But regrettably, we also do have to acknowledge that a significant percentage of those refugees are not genuine refugees. A lot of them are would-be terrorists, and that is something which needs to be addressed. But it is no surprise whatsoever. You know, ISIS, al-Nusra, the so-called Free Syrian Army, they saw an opportunity to access Europe, to access the European Union through the refugee crisis. So no surprise that many of these so-called refugees are, of course, terrorists.
Okay. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor of Politics First out of London.